Hi, I'm Kip Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I make a lot of content here on YouTube, mostly engaging with various issues of critical biblical scholarship. And this invariably means that I end up encountering a lot of bad Christian apologetics or just Christian apologetics, which is mostly bad. One of the issues that I encounter with some frequency, and which is closely informed by a lot of the work that I do already in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is this famous text from Psalm chapter 22, verses 16 in the English or 17 in the Hebrew. This is a famous psalm, in large part because the New Testament writers drew from it heavily when describing the death of Jesus. Now, this particular verse, Psalm 22:17, is of special interest to Christians because of what they think it has to say about Jesus. Most English translations will translate the verse like this. I'm starting in the English in verse 15 here, and I'm reading first from the NIV. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. So, when Christians have been reading this psalm for hundreds, over 1,000 years now, and they hear something like that, piercing of my hands and my feet, could this actually be describing the death of Jesus by crucifixion? And even more remarkable, if this is a psalm that was written by David, then this is something that was predicted hundreds of years prior to even the invention of crucifixion as a method of torture and execution by the Persians and eventually perfected by the Romans. Well, on both points, there are obviously problems. In the first place, this psalm was not composed by David. David didn't actually compose any psalms or anything that we're aware of, if he was even a real person at all. We know precious little about the actual man David, only this legendary figure from the Old Testament who was the second ruler of the so-called United Kingdom, the fabled United Kingdom. No, in reality, this psalm is difficult to pinpoint to date. Scholars are all over the map about whether it's even pre-exilic or post-exilic, but I'm not even sure that matters so much because there are textual problems within this psalm, which brings me to my second point. So that was the translation in the NIV. Similarly, other translations that evangelicals are fond of, such as the ESV, read like this. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Also, in the New American Standard Bible. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Even the very old Revised Standard Version reads like this. Yea, dogs are round about me. A company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. The standard English translation of the Old Testament for hundreds of years, the King James Version, reads like this. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. So there seems to be considerable agreement by these versions about the translation of this text. But look at what happens when you start to review some of the other translations that have been provided for this text in more recent years. This is the NRSV, which tends to be the preferred scholarly English translation of the Old Testament. I don't think it gets everything right, but it's got a pretty good general feel to it that most scholars appreciate. For dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and my feet have shriveled. Wow. Well, that's different, and that's kind of interesting. But then look here at the Jewish Publication Society and how they have translated this verse, numbered verse 17 in the Hebrew. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. So what's going on here with this particular verse? As you may have guessed, there is a textual issue, and this textual issue stems from disagreement between the standard Hebrew version of the Old Testament text, known as the Masoretic text, and the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint. In the Hebrew Masoretic text, it reads, like a lion, my hands and my feet, which on its own is strange in that this clause is lacking a verb. And scholars have produced numerous amounts, volumes of literature attempting to explain why or what's going on with this text. Some of those scholars have posited that the original text actually read in agreement with the Septuagint. They have pierced my hands and my feet. But even this is fairly problematic because the Greek word there that is commonly translated as pierced is horaxon and generally means to dig or to bore out. It's used predominantly in the Bible for digging pits in the ground or digging a grave for a king or a nobleman. The more common suggestion for a long time was that the Greek translator arrived at this word by mistake. On its own, I mean, that sounds kind of odd, right? They dug my hands and my feet. This difference in the Septuagint is the result of most likely a transcriptional error or an error on the part of the translator in terms of what the Hebrew word that he was looking at even meant. Is this like a lion? Is it they dug? Is it something else? The translators of the NRSV have landed on a similar looking Hebrew root for this word, suggesting that, maybe it meant something like shriveled. Other suggestions are something in the range of they bound. This would also provide some parallel for the clause before it, which probably adds some strength to the viability of this particular reading. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a video that was brought to my attention fairly recently by my good friend, Zach Miller, over at What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Please go and check out his video and like and subscribe to his channel. He did a video recently reviewing some of the errors made by another creator, an Egyptologist by the name of Dr. David A. Falk.
I'm a polymath.
One of the reasons why I wanted to make this video here is because he spends the briefest little bit of time talking about the evidence from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This would be evidence from the oldest manuscript copy that we have of this particular verse. So let's take a look at what Dr. Falk has to say.
Difference between like a lion, which is ki ori, or kori, which is pierced, it's a difference of one letter. And that one letter is an aleph.
So right away, I have to point out that the pronunciation of these words is incorrect. It's not ki ori and kori. It's ka'ari and karu. Ka'ari being the noun, lion, prefixed with the inseparable preposition ke, meaning as or like a lion, and karu, a third masculine plural verb meaning they pierced. And the difference here is not just one letter. Yes, there is a difference between these two readings in that ka'ari contains an aleph, where karu does not. But that's not the only difference. Very importantly, the first word, ka'ari, is spelled kaf, aleph, resh, yod, whereas the verb, karu, is spelled kaf, resh, vav. So the last letter on each of these words is different. And importantly, significantly, the focus is often on these two letters, the vav and the yod, because in ancient manuscripts, in Second Temple Jewish manuscripts, the vav and the yod often look remarkably similar to one another. It would be understandable for a scribe to be reading his text and making a new one and committing an error of what we call transposition, or of vav yod transference, where he's confusing one for the other in his new manuscript. And those are the sorts of errors that get perpetuated over a longer period of time.
In the Masoretic text, it is ki ori with the aleph.
Ka'ari with the aleph.
So it is like a lion. But if you look at the Septuagint, it says pierced.
Now, in the Septuagint, it doesn't actually say pierced. The word there is horaxon, which means they dug. And this is probably a translation of what the writer understands to be the Hebrew word karu, which also means they dug. So it's either like a lion or they dug my hands and my feet. It's Christian readers and Christian translators who have insisted that this is somehow metaphoric for piercing of the hands and the feet. However, it's a very odd way to put this. It's a very odd word choice. There are plenty of verbs in Hebrew and in Greek to convey this idea of being pierced or stabbed or having nails driven through your hands and your feet without using this verb karu or horaxon.
But we also had a Dead Sea Scroll, which is 4Q Psalm F.
So this is kind of an interesting choice to me. There are actually two manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Psalms F that Dr. Falk mentioned. 4Q 88 dates from the 1st century BCE and is our oldest copy of this particular verse, of this particular text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it's very fragmentary. But this reading also appears in another manuscript. Much more famously, it appears in the so-called Nachal Hever Psalm Scroll, which is a later text. It dates to some time after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. It's late 1st century CE. And the reading there is more complete, a little bit more difficult to see, just because this particular fragment is badly abraded or damaged, which kind of conceals or obscures what the actual reading is. However, scholars tend to be agreed that this is Kaf, Aleph, Resh, Vav. The problem with that is that on its own, that doesn't mean anything. Some have suggested that this could be karu, the verb, they dug, but with a lengthened spelling, I don't particularly like that explanation because it is sort of an unusual way to spell that particular word. It's unusual for scribes in this period to insert helping vowels in verbs in places like that. I tend to think that this manuscript just provides a little bit more evidence as to the types of errors that can occur in the transmission of the text and how the Septuagint translator ended up with a manuscript from which he translated horaxon, they dug. It probably looked very much like the Nachal Hever Psalm Scroll. Now, he's going to talk a little bit about this other manuscript, 4Q Psalms F. So let's listen to hear what else he has to say about it.
Which has the Kaf, Resh, there's no Aleph there. So that's pierced.
So he just suggested there that this manuscript, this oldest copy of Psalm 22 that we have, has Kaf, Resh, but with no Aleph. Therefore, we can conclude that this text originally read Karu. But this is also really problematic. And I suspect that these sorts of problems arise because people aren't actually looking at the manuscripts and the fragments for themselves, which is something that anyone can do. You can go to the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library. You can look up high-resolution photographs of every single fragment in the entire collection. You can see this fragment for yourself, and even if you don't know Hebrew, you can compare it to a copy of a Hebrew Bible text and see where the letters line up. So here I have a picture of the fragment itself. So here's the fragment. This is fragment 1, which contains text from Psalm 22:14 to verse 17. But you'll notice in my picture here that there's actually another small fragment sitting just to the left of this. This together is fragments 1 and 2 of 4Q Psalm 88. One of the problems with this particular composite fragment is that we're not entirely clear where the second fragment aligns with the first fragment. How far away is it from the first fragment? This makes a big deal for how you're going to understand or read this text. The text from verse 17 and the disputed word in question here appears on the bottom line there. On the right side of the fragment along the bottom, you can make out the tops of letters belonging to Hakifni instead of Hakifuni, which means he surrounded me, which is a textual variant for they surrounded me. But the word, either ka'ari or karu, appears right after this. And if you look on this fragment, all that's left there are two tiny ink traces. Traces from the tops of two unidentified letters. So this is what the editors of this fragment had to say about this particular reading. The central part of the top of Kaf has flaked off, prior to which it had the same width and slant as that in Chochmetam, appearing in column 3, line 18. The manuscript may well have had the grammatically correct reading Karu, with some Masoretic manuscripts and editions and the Septuagint. So I have some big problems here. While it is certainly possible to reconstruct Karu based on those tiny ink traces there, this is far from certain. Dr. Falk is not entirely correct in stating that the Kof and the Resh are on this fragment without the Aleph. Yes, that's how the editors have transcribed this fragment, but this could be any number of readings, really. We might think we are getting a little bit of help from the presence of fragment 2, which then would, set some limitations on the amount of space we have for reconstructing this word. You can certainly reconstruct the text to read Karu, Kof, Resh, Vav, but you can also, by repositioning fragment 2 slightly to the left, reconstruct it to read Ka'ari, And those ink traces along the top belong to two letters. The first probably being a cough, but the second could be part of a resh or could be part of an aleph. We just don't know. Now, I tend to think from a material perspective that the longer reading ka'ari maybe makes some more sense, because on both fragments is also a vertical line of damage. And when you set one next to the other so that this vertical line of damage corresponds, that leaves you the requisite space for ka'ari. But I really wanted to show this for two reasons. I wanted to show that there's just not enough there to speak confidently in any way regarding how to read this verse. And secondly, even if we are tempted to reconstruct the text in the gap between these two fragments, fragments 1 and fragment 2, you can reconstruct it in multiple ways. So when you get right down to it, this particular manuscript doesn't really help at all. It doesn't help us to determine what the oldest reading of this text was. Let's take a look and see what Dr. Falk has to say next.
When you look at, say, the Syriac Peshta, the Septuagint, say the
it's Peshitta is the name of the Syriac translation of the Old Testament, not Peshta.
The Septuagint, say the translations, the ancient translations, it does seem to be leaning more towards along the lines of pierced. I think the superior reading here is probably pierced.
So he concludes here by looking at how other ancient versions have handled this particular verse, which is good text critical practice whenever I am trying to get a sense of how to understand a difficult passage in the Hebrew text. I will usually turn to the Greek translation in the Septuagint, as well as other versions such as the Peshitta and the Targumim. Those are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew text. So Dr. Falk has also correctly noted that the Peshitta translates this term in agreement with the Septuagint and against the Masoretic text. The actual reading in the Peshitta is Bazu Idali Weragli. They, that is a bad company that was mentioned just prior to this, tore up or pierced my hands and my feet. So yeah, that's agreement. Now, it needs to be pointed out that while the Peshitta can be useful in terms of helping us to understand what the Hebrew text looked like, this is a source that is not altogether that old. Our earliest manuscripts of the Peshitta are medieval. Scholars suggest that the text of the Peshitta dates back only to the 3rd or maybe the 2nd century CE. Moreover, the Peshitta was a text that was collected and transmitted by the Syrian church, the Christian church. So there's no surprise at all that this would find agreement with the Septuagint and a fairly Christocentric reading that would be informed by Jesus's crucifixion in the New Testament. But Dr. Falk also missed one of the ancient witnesses. In the Psalms Targum, it reads, Ka'ari Eidai Veragli. A company of evildoers has surrounded me, biting like a lion my hands and feet. This version seems to agree more with the Masoretic text. You can also see that the Aramaic translator of this Targum is working to fix the text. There's problems with it, which is why he has inserted a verb here that is just not present in the Hebrew, biting like a lion my hands and my feet. I just don't think that you can use the versional evidence from the Syriac, the Septuagint, and the Targums to strengthen your idea that this text should read, "They dug, not they pierced." I remain unconvinced that the Septuagint reading of Psalm 22:17 is the preferred reading, the oldest reading, the original reading of this text. I continue to think that it's a problematic text for a reason. There's possibly textual corruption that has taken place here in the first place, which is why there's so much dispute and disagreement among even the ancient witnesses to this text. To say nothing for the manuscripts that we have, the Hebrew manuscripts that we have, which also show that scribes were uncertain. They were struggling with what to do with this passage. I would be satisfied if we had an unproblematic attestation for the ancient reading in the Septuagint, but that is not what we have. We have the Septuagint collected and transmitted by Christian communities and attesting this odd reading. "They dug my hands and my feet." As I said, probably originating from a scribal error. We have a Christian version that very loosely follows the Septuagint in the Peshitta. We have late Aramaic translations that do not. And we have two problematic Hebrew manuscripts, only one of which predates the Jewish war and which does not actually preserve the reading, and in the end provides no useful information. In the future, before taking people's words at face value for what they say about what certain manuscripts have to say, I encourage you to check these things out yourself. The resources are available, and people purporting to be scholars in the Bible who have the wherewithal to know where to find these resources and read these texts, they should be looking at them as well.